Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. Here I am again, joined with Keith Preston to finish part two of our discussion on the Second World War. So we left off, Keith, talking about the causes of the war. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the war itself, more from a political perspective than necessarily a military or tactical perspective. But one of the key blunders in the Allied war effort, by Allied, I mean the Western Allies, was the insistence on unconditional surrender. I think it was after Casablanca in early 1943. Now, it's generally recognized that unconditional surrender was an absolute disaster. The Germans and the Japanese knew they could accept no better terms than unconditional surrender, so they'll just fight to the bitter end. In fact, Eisenhower, I'm paraphrasing, said, if a man is going to hang or face 20 bayonets, he'll face 20 bayonets. Many British and American officers were upset at fighting men, were upset at the terms of unconditional surrender because they knew that it would make their job a lot harder. The Germans and the Japanese would fight harder. Peace was that much further away because any sort of more settled position would not have been acceptable to the establishment. And in fact, it only more entrenched the Hitler regime. I mean, Goebbels was able to use unconditional surrender, say, look how barbaric these allies are. You know, they want to treat us like slaves when we're defeated. And I think that's the only. In fact, H.B. Liddell Hart said the only beneficiary of unconditional surrender was Stalin, because according to H.B. Liddell Hart, because the Germans fought to the bitter end, it gave Stalin time to get into Central Europe. If some sort of negotiated settlement had been gotten earlier, Stalin could have been kept out of Europe.
Yeah, I think there's much to be said for that. And once again, I think it was a very similar situation to what we saw in the First World War, in the sense that both wars were essentially ideological wars. The Western Allies viewed themselves as not merely fighting geopolitical enemies, but fighting ideological enemies, fighting criminals, if you will. That is, they thought that the Germans and the Japanese not only needed to be defeated or contained, they needed to be punished, and there needed to be a righteous vengeance enacted upon them. And I think that by itself contributed a great deal to the way that the war effort was handled. The fact that the Americans the Western Allies, but it was really just the Americans at this point. The fact that the Americans continued to advance into Germany to the degree that they did, and for the purpose of completely wiping Germany out, which, as you said, that allowed the Soviets to come in from the other direction, and then the two met, and that's how Germany was partitioned for 40 years. And the same thing happened in Japan, arguably on an even bigger scale. There's no evidence, for example, that it was necessary for the United States to completely incinerate Japanese cities in order to actually win the war. I think the United States committed those acts in large part just as a retaliatory act, saying, well, look, they bombed us at Pearl Harbor. We'll show them what a bombing is all about. Look at the bombs we've got. And I think that a lot of that was purely gratuitous in nature. There's a common argument that's made to justify the use of atomic weapons in Japan by saying, well, they're arguing that it saved lives because it made it unnecessary to stage a land invasion of Japan, and that would have cost more American lives and things like that. But that argument only holds if you're going to try to demand a complete total surrender by the Japanese. Anything less than that, a conditional surrender certainly would have been viable without the use of those kinds of weapons. And even then, I don't know that the argument holds. So in both cases, I think that's really a big part of what happened in that war. Essentially, it was a repeat of what happened at Versailles. It was an effort to not simply defeat the enemy, but impose this kind of righteous vengeance upon the enemy. And the there were some people in the American government actually had plans for imposing a Versailles-like situation on Germany after the war. In fact, Hans Morgenthau, who was an official in the State Department in the Roosevelt administration, well, by that time it would have been the Truman administration, he actually wanted to reduce Germany to a pre-industrial state and never again allow Germany to develop any heavy industry. Now, fortunately, that didn't happen. Fortunately, the United States tried to rebuild Western Europe, and in particular in Germany, you had fairly competent leadership at the end of the war, and Germany was able to recover economically fairly quickly. But one of the original ideas, though, was to totally decimate Germany, which probably would have meant that Germany would have undergone a communist revolution and that the entirety of Germany would have fallen under the sphere of the Soviets rather than just half of it. But I do think this idea of ideological conflict played a big role in these policies.
Yeah, you're right. One of the things that is, I think, interesting and related to this is the if you look at the history of, say, beginning with say Westphalia, where Europeans try to make war civilized, if such a thing is even possible. But beginning with Westphalia, they try to say, look, women and children and non-combatants, you really shouldn't kill these people. And as a general rule of thumb, the European nations, at least amongst themselves, kept to that rule. They generally avoided targeting women and children. Now, of course, in sieges and certain kinds of combat situations, that's inevitable. But they were never the target. They were never considered a legitimate target to be attacked. Now, what we see, and this seems to be correlated with liberalism in the West, whether it be the French Revolution or the American Revolution, and ideology, is that each century, the percentage of war dead, the civilian percentage grows. We see with Napoleon a very big shift. You can look at Spain with the Spanish ulcer, where the French would resort to brutal tactics, probably tactics that had been perfected in the Vendée during the Revolution itself. But they started to have a larger percentage of the civilian population. Then in World War I, mostly on the side of the Allies with the British blockade, civilian casualties continued to mount until World War II, where at this point, civilian casualties outnumber military casualties by a wide margin. And then in the modern age, most casualties in any given conflict are civilian. And World War II is interesting in that progression, and that it's kind of the tipping point where, for the first time since Westphalia, more civilians are killed. And they're not killed by accident, they're killed on purpose. So it's a twofold change. They're being killed on purpose now, which before would have been more like say, during the Civil War, American Civil War, or like, say, the wars of German unification, or even World War I, directly shooting civilians was unacceptable in most cases.
Yeah, well, we do see this progression from sort of a gentlemanly approach to war to the concept of a total war, where it's not just the enemy army that you're fighting, it's the enemy society, that someone else is an enemy just by being a member of an enemy society. You see that, we talked about this in one of our previous podcasts, but we see this in the American Civil War, I think, is very much a prototype for this, where the northern side, the Union side, sort of overthrew the traditional idea that war is supposed to be combat between gentlemen. I mean, at least, on some degree, that kind of ethos had prevailed prior to that, and started using things like what we now think of as total war tactics or scorched earth tactics, where they would burn entire cities, they'd burn crops, they'd try to starve out the civilian population. And by the time of the world wars of the 20th century, by that time they had machine guns and poison gas and aircraft and atomic weapons and all of these kinds of things. And that concept was expanded to the nth degree, in the sense that it was considered perfectly legitimate to use these kinds of weapons and these kinds of tactics against anyone who represented an enemy society. And you see this in the bombing campaigns in Europe during the war. You see that in Dresden and Hamburg, where they chose targets in those bombing raids that were chosen for the purpose of maximizing civilian casualties. In the past, the idea was you try to keep civilian casualties to a minimum. Now, maybe it's unavoidable, maybe it's going to happen anyway, maybe there's individual leaders that disregard that, but you start seeing this idea that targeting civilians and generating civilian casualties is fine. You start to see that when you start seeing war being transformed into wars not between armies but between societies and between the ideologies that these societies represent. And not only that, but you start seeing war being fought in a way where they're trying to maximize civilian casualties by targeting large cities for bombing raids, by inflicting terror on the civilian population, hopefully inspiring them to overthrow their government and things like that. You saw the Allies doing that in Europe, and you also saw the United States doing that in Japan. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was the firebombing campaign against Tokyo, which is just sort of a prelude to what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in all of these cases, this is really an act of state terrorism against the civilian populations of other societies. I mean, it's the same logic that groups like Al Qaeda use when they carry out terrorist acts in such a way that is intended to maximize the number of casualties, not minimize the casualties, but maximize the casualties. And they do this for the purpose of inflicting the greatest amount of terror they can on civilians whom they blame for supporting their government, because they view the whole society as an enemy society. It's not just an enemy army. It's not just an enemy state. The whole society is an enemy society. And in part, that's used to intimidate other societies, trying to motivate people to, overturn whatever government that they are ostensibly supporting, and this kind of thing. So it's really just full-on state terrorism and in a massive scale, and that's how the two world wars were fought, particularly World War II. World War II was fought on that level. It was all about inflicting maximum amounts of civilian casualties, state terrorism, collective punishment. The whole society is to be blamed for the crimes of its leadership.
Yeah. In fact, in his autobiography about the war, William Leahy, who was the theater commander of the Pacific, wrote that he said, this is about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The lethal possibilities of atomic warfare in the future are frightening. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted ethical standards common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children. You see, I mean, Leahy was kind of old school in that regard. And you see, this whole idea of terrorizing civilian populations, I mean, this is the kind of thing the ancient Assyrians, the Romans, the Turks and the Mongols and the Huns, I mean, this is literally the most barbarous activity you can engage in. And the whole bombing campaign, you see, the actual German policy of bombing was not terror bombing. The communists made a lot of the bombing of the city of Guernica in 1937 when the Condor Legion bombed it during the Spanish Civil War. But the German Air Force was a tactical air force. And subsequent historical investigation has debunked the idea that Guernica was a, quote, terror bombing incident. The idea was for the German Air Force was that it would support the troops on the ground by bombing tactical targets. Strategic bombers were never really on the German radar. And while Germans might have bombed cities like Warsaw and Rotterdam, that was because they were being invaded by the German army. They weren't bombing the city for the sake of bombing the city. They were bombing it to clear the way for the ground troops. The Allies had a very different view of bombing cities. Their idea was you terrorize them, and they were based off the Italian theorist. I think it was, I forget his name now. I think it was like Guhot. He was an Italian theorist in the 1920s who argued that if you bomb cities, you could bring entire populations into submission. But for the exact opposite was the case. You cause them to rally behind the political leadership of their country. And England was actually the first of the major combatants to engage in bombing cities in that way. And Hitler actually had asked Churchill to cease doing that. But Churchill defended the bombings as the only way England could strike back at Germany during the dark years of 1940. And when Churchill refused to listen to these attacks, to Hitler's warning that he would retaliate, he then began the Blitz. And the Blitz was terror bombing. In fact, the Battle of Britain was being won by the Luftwaffe bombing airfields and radar installations. They lost the Battle of Britain because they shifted to civilian targets, which allowed the RAF to rebuild the airfields, to rebuild the radar installations, and to recover from the drubbing they were taking from the Luftwaffe. So it was actually tactically strategically decisive for the Germans to shift focus to bombing cities. But it was never really a part of the military doctrine to bomb cities in this way. And as bad as the Blitz was, the Allies, when they bombed German and Japanese cities, did it to a scale that dwarfed the Blitz. And so one of the rank hypocrisies of the war is that the Germans and the Japanese were condemned for bombing cities, which again were mostly cities they were already invading. So was it really terror bombing or just softening the ground up for the troops coming in? Whereas the Allies, ultimately culminating the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had massive air fleets of hundreds of bombers that would just, Dresden lost 250,000 lives. Tokyo lost 200,000 lives in these bombing raids. And nothing, the Blitz and the Japanese bombing of Chongqing was nothing at all close to that. And it's very telling, too, during the 30s and 40s when the Germans and Japanese were caught bombing cities. The Soviets bombed Helsinki in Finland during the Soviet-Finnish War, and yet none of the Western news presses really criticized Stalin for bombing Helsinki, but they criticized Hitler and Japan. But then, of course, the Western powers did it on a scale far larger than the Axis ever dreamed of, and killed millions of people that way. It had to be millions. I read in a book that it might have been 1.5 million Germans were killed by the bombing. And the other nature of the bombing was that it was indiscriminate. One of the reasons why Europe was devastated, including places like Italy and France, was because the United States bombed French and Italian cities because there were Germans in those cities. And so they would level cities of their, France, erstwhile ally. American bombers destroyed the Monte Cassino in Italy, the monastery full of medieval art. And this is really like Mongol tactics, like Genghis Khan style tactics, scorched earth and just annihilating women and children. It's really just unbelievable. The fact that the United States could so quickly go from a kind of gentleman's army where we accept rules, quote unquote, to going to Genghis Khan is really amazing.
Well, a similar thing happened in Asia, and you pointed out that a little bit. Talking about the casualties in Tokyo and places like that. But the propaganda that was produced in the United States during the war, and some of that I think is available online. You can watch old newsreel footage and that kind of thing of war propaganda against the Japanese from that time period. The Japanese are depicted as these kind of comical, kind of subhuman, barbarian people, and obviously the idea is to say that they're less than human and therefore it's okay to slaughter them. And of course they were. The memory of that many Americans and other Westerners have is that they had the kamikaze bombers and they had this kind of death cult that was built up around that, the kind of that you die for the emperor, and that kind of thing. But what's interesting is that the American bombing of Tokyo and Hiroshima and places like that targeted the Christian population of Japan. In particular, in Hiroshima, you had a massive Christian population. That was really the center of Christianity in Japan, and that was one of the cities that they dropped the atomic bomb on. So it's and it was the same way in Europe. They viewed the Westerners, the Allies, they viewed the Italians, the Germans as as these barbarian Huns or Wops or whatever, and that in their mind justified slaughtering them. It was really no different than the way they treated the Native Americans, the American Indians during the Indian Wars.
Well, exactly. The United States, I think, willingness to engage in total war was itself a byproduct of it being a frontier country. We had grown up fighting Native Americans, and as Lawrence Weegley writes in his War Before Civilization, prehistoric warfare is extremely vicious. It's total war. Men, women, and children are targeted. Now, granted, the total casualties are very low, population density is low in prehistoric societies, but the percentage of the population is very high. And it's a common throughout Africa and North and South America that these settler societies who engages indigenous populations see this kind of total war, and they resort to that not only against the natives but against each other. And Europeans didn't have that problem of a settler society, at least not in Europe proper. So I don't, except maybe Russia and Spain fighting off Moors and Tartars, which might explain why they were also more prone to atrocities than the more centrally located European powers. But that whole idea that being a frontier nation, I think, is partially what leads America to be more willing to engage in such activity. But it's interesting. But the other thing is, another level of hypocrisy is these war crimes of bombing cities that we wanted to try the Germans for and the Japanese. We did the same thing, but on a grander scale. The same with the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. Dönitz led the German U-boat fleet to sink millions of tons of Allied shipping in order to, hopefully, to forestall an invasion of Europe, which he wasn't able to achieve. But we wanted to try him for war crimes. But it was turned out that our admiral, Nimitz, ordered the same thing in the South Pacific against the Japanese. And so we're going to try the Germans for crimes that we ourselves have committed. In fact, this leads us to, I think, a very important part about the Second World War and the moral question is Nuremberg. Nuremberg was supposed to be this hallmark in international justice. The UN constantly invokes it, like when they tried Slobodan Milosevic or when we tried Saddam Hussein. It's in the vein of Nuremberg, this great, piece of Western jurisprudence, which of course was a farce. It was victor's justice. When you have Soviet judges on the bench, those same judges who had been a part of Stalin's show trials in the 1930s, the idea that they have any pretense of legality is a joke. And the fact that many times the Germans or the Japanese were not even allowed to know what they were being accused with or what evidence the accusers had that they were being accused with. In fact, I remember reading that Alfred Jodl, at one point I think was head of the German army, was told by the American officer in charge of watching him that they weren't going to tell him where the information was that they got to indict him, and he actually smuggled some of that information into General Jodl. So the idea that you can try somebody without even showing them what they're being accused with is a complete violation of Western jurisprudence. Has more in common with the Stalinist show trial than it does with Western law. Furthermore, a lot of these crimes were post hoc crimes. They were not considered criminal actions before the war, but after the war they were, and so they were tried for that. And thirdly, the Allies were guilty of almost all the crimes they were trying the Axis of. In fact, Chief Justice Jackson wrote to Truman that we are guilty of many of these crimes. In fact, a little known fact at the end of the war is that after the war, hundreds of thousands of Germans and Axis personnel were used as slave labor in the Soviet Union and by the Western Allies, including France and Belgium, to rebuild after the war. And Chief Justice Jackson wrote in that letter to Truman that he said that the French are using slave labor as I speak of German POWs. So clearly the Allies themselves were guilty of the same crimes they were trying the Nazis of as Nuremberg was going on. And of course, the Soviet Union had committed all these crimes many times over to begin with.
Yeah, well, that's always been a aspect of the Nuremberg trials that's debated as to what degree this constitutes victor's justice. And I think a very powerful case can be made that it was, most of what the defendants at Nuremberg were put on trial for were things that were not considered crimes under international law at the time. The things they were put on trial for were crimes against the peace, aggressive war. Now the genocide trials, the from the concentration camps and all that was a part of that prosecution as well, where they put Nazi doctors on trial and that kind of stuff as well. So it did have that dimension to it. But even with that aspect of it, when you consider that the Soviet Union was part of the court that was trying this, when at the very same time that they were trying the Nazi leaders for having run the concentration camps, the Soviets were. This was in the 1930s and 1940s, when the Gulag was in full force, was in full operational mode. And the fact that the Soviets were allowed to sit on the tribunal at Nuremberg was it really is rather extraordinary. And then when it comes to crimes against the peace and war crimes and things about like that, I mean, for the Americans that had incinerated entire cities during the course of the war to set themselves up as somehow legitimate in imposing punishment on other states that had done comparable things was a bit silly as well. And the same thing was done in Japan. I mean, they actually had the military tribunals in Japan that functioned in a very similar way to what happened at Nuremberg. And of course, now Nuremberg is supposed to be the standard for international war crimes and all of these kinds of things. But I mean, it's still just as farcical as it ever was. I mean, you have people in the UN, like American representatives to the UN, like this Samantha Power woman, who are always talking about how we have to have this global crusade against genocide. All the while the United States is sponsoring aggression and massacres all over the world. So it's really just a really extraordinary thing to watch.
Yeah. In fact, Curtis LeMay even admitted that he was a war criminal. He said, killing Japanese didn't bother me very much at the time. It was getting the war over that bothered me. So I wasn't worried particularly about how many people we killed in getting the job done. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Fortunately, we were on the winning side.
Yeah.
And he said that in, hold on, I have the footnote right here. It was, Alfred H. Hurley and Robert C. Einhart, Air and Air Power, the Proceedings of the 8th Military History Symposium, United States Air Force Academy, October 18 to 20, 1978. So, yeah, I mean, it was a war crime, plain and simple. And none of the Allies were tried for it. In fact, Germany was tried for, Erich Rieder, the head of the Navy, the German Navy was tried for invading Norway in 1940. Now, H.B. Liddell Hart points out that, well, yes, he did invade Norway because England was invading at the same time. They literally beat England by a few days. I mean, England was already on the way to invade Norway. In fact, Hitler did not want to escalate the war into Scandinavia. Scandinavia had been neutral in World War I, and he seemed to want to keep that going. But when the British were invading Norway, threatening the Swedish oil or iron ore, then he had to act. And of course, but they did the same thing. Now, this leads to an interesting thing. In just war theory, there's a guy named Walzer, and he argues that
Michael Walzer, yeah.
Michael Walzer. And he argues about this thing called the supreme emergency, where the rules of a war can be broken if it's a life and death struggle. And of course, he mentions Norway. And he also mentions Liddell Hart. And he says that, well, H.B. Liddell Hart doesn't seem to think that the bad guys don't have any rights. And, I mean, it's a patently absurd position. And we know it's an absurd position. Have you ever seen the movie A Man for All Seasons?
I have not, no.
About, I think it's Thomas More. He was tried by the Protestants under Henry VIII and executed. But there's a scene in the movie, a very important scene, where there's a suitor to one of his daughters, and he's a Protestant. And there's another suitor who's Catholic. And, of course, Thomas More being Catholic is not going to allow the Protestant suitor to have his daughter. But the Protestant suitor begins to turn against Thomas More and sees the political power shifting to the Protestants. And the Catholic suitor says to Thomas More, we need to take this guy out. And he's like, well, but Thomas More's like, what crime has he committed? He's like, well, none yet. He's a heretic. And so we need to break the law to get to this guy. And Thomas More says, I would give the devil his day in court, because if I broke all the laws of England to get the devil could then turn around and take me and say, well, what laws do you have left? You broke all your laws to get me. And that's the point. Is Thomas, at least in the movie, Thomas More points out that even if it's the devil himself, you have to give him the rights of law, because if you break them to get to him, then the rest of us, the rest of our rights, the rest of our legal rights are under threat. Maybe they can break those laws to catch us because we're a perceived threat. And this kind of farcical notion that, well, in fact, if anybody had to be worried about being dismembered, it was actually Germany, because Germany was dismembered at the end of the war. So according to Michael Walzer, I guess Germany would have had a right to extreme measures to protect itself because it literally was facing dismemberment.
Yeah, well, and as I said earlier in the program, after the war, Hans Morgenthau in the State Department actually had plans for reducing Germany to a pre-industrial state. Fortunately for the Germans and probably for the rest of the world, those plans didn't prevail, but that was in the works at the time. So
that probably would have killed 20 million Germans.
Yeah, well, not only would there have been mass starvation and things of that nature, but I suspect Germany would have fallen under the entirety of Germany would have fallen under Soviet influence if that had happened. That's probably true. And which in turn meant that Germany would have had a powerful base right there in the middle of Central Europe, which they could then use to expand into Western Europe.
Oh yeah, it would have been very disastrous for the West if the communists taken over West Germany. But one of the things is, if you look at, so now that I guess we're nearing maybe the end of the war, we look at what were the results. Well, let's first look, what were the stated objectives? Well, officially, we fought the war to protect Poland. That's what England officially fought the war for. Now, the funny thing is, though, even though the war was allegedly fought to protect Poland, Poland was handed up to a silver platter to Stalin. In fact, Stalin invaded Poland when Hitler did. And yet the Allies did not declare war on Stalin, but only Hitler, which really just shows you what a farce this whole thing was. If Polish territorial integrity was at stake, they would have declared war on Stalin too. But rather than declaring war on Stalin, they end up rewarding Stalin by giving him not only all of Poland, but all of Eastern Europe as well, which gets into the point of appeasement. If Chamberlain gave Hitler the Sudetenland to buy time, and that's considered a terrible mistake, Roosevelt and Churchill at Yalta, or even before that at Tehran, giving Stalin all of Eastern Europe for nothing in return, there were no guarantees that Stalin would keep up his end of the bargain, is an appeasement and a compromise 100-fold worse than Chamberlain. I mean, one really has to question the mental faculties of our leaders in their discussions with Stalin. Franklin Roosevelt famously said this: "I just have a hunch that Stalin is not that kind of man. Harry Hopkins says he's not, and that he doesn't want anything except security for his own country. And I think that if I give him everything I possibly can and ask nothing from him in return, noblesse oblige, he won't try to annex anything and will work with me for world democracy and peace." Now, is that not the statement of a raving lunatic?
Yeah, it's really interesting how they underestimated the ambitions of someone like Stalin. Well, actually, George Kennan wrote about that. He mentioned that during his meetings with the Russians in the Soviet Union, at the very end of the war, in the beginning of the Cold War period, that it became clear that a lot of Western leaders had no idea what they were dealing with when it came to Joseph Stalin. Kennan had met Stalin personally and had dealt with him, in a diplomatic context, and said, this is, the Western leaders really have no idea what kind of person this is. He knew what was up with Stalin from the beginning. But yeah, it's rather extraordinary that the Western powers had this kind of view of Stalin as just this, this peaceful, benevolent guy that just wants the Russians to be left alone to mind their own business. And some of there are many other comments you can dig up that were made about Stalin. I know there's a quote from Franklin Roosevelt where he was talking about religion, the role of religion in the Soviet Union. And he says, yeah, well, in their constitution, they say, they have separation of church and state like we do, or whatever, as if it was a comparable situation. And this was during the time that Stalin was, waging a ruthless, essentially genocidal war against the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Western powers seem to have had not a clue as to what the nature of this regime really was, which is interesting considering that the Bolshevik regime had been such a pariah just a few decades earlier. I mean, all during the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, during the time that Lenin was in power, on into the 1920s up until the 1930s, the Bolshevik regime was considered an outlaw regime. It was considered a criminal state. And all of a sudden, there's an about face during the time of World War II. And now you see in American war propaganda, they talk about Uncle Joe, our friend and ally against the Germans. And to a large degree, it seems like that was actually taken seriously, even by Western leaders. They seem to have viewed him in that way. Perhaps Churchill didn't, but certainly I think Roosevelt did, which is astounding.
Well, Churchill did for a time. If you read Pat Buchanan's book, he has I don't know the quotes offhand, but some pretty cringeworthy statements by Churchill. Another farcical aspect of all this is Churchill's 1946 Missouri speech of the Iron Curtain. He acts like he's some sort of great prophet, but he actually drew the lines of the Iron Curtain with Stalin, with the you might have heard of the dirty note, the secret note, where he divides up Eastern Europe with Stalin. I mean, he drew the lines of the Iron Curtain, and then he acts surprised that it happened.
Yes, and I think that it's interesting to consider why they would have viewed Stalin in this particular way, and I think it's something that's difficult to explain. Some people have attributed it to, communist sympathizers in Western governments and things like that. But that, while there was certainly some of that, I don't think that's offers an explanation of the whole situation. I think that it may have simply become out of weariness of the war. Perhaps they just didn't want to fight anyone else at that point. But then you also have to look at the massive interventions that were done around the world in the years that followed. So it's a bit difficult to ascertain why they would have had this idea that they could simply turn over, the much of the Eurasian landmass to the Soviet Union.
Well, exactly. But as far as Stalin's true intentions, there was never any doubt. He invaded Poland with Hitler. He invaded the Baltic states. He invaded Finland. There was never any doubt of Stalin's, even before Hitler invaded. Even before Hitler invaded, there was never any doubt. But what World War II really shows us is that not that the bad guys lose, but that if you're corrupt and wicked enough, you can, like Stalin, you can not only you can play both sides and win. Stalin invaded Poland to help Hitler. Hitler attacked him, and then the West pulled Stalin out, and then he got Poland and all of Eastern Europe as a result, which was a complete and absolute disaster for not only the free world but for Eastern Europe. Since not a single, it's very clear, in 1941, not a single Eastern European country voluntarily allied with the Soviet Union, because all of them knew what that would mean. And they all sadly had to learn that in the succeeding decades. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that in turn raises the question of what were Stalin's real motive, what were Stalin's real beliefs all along. There's been this debate among historians about, well, was Stalin a true believing communist ideologue, or was he something else? Was he just simply the equivalent of a mafia leader? The Soviet Union was his gang, and it's just about expanding their own turf. I think it can be interpreted either way. I think a lot of times people develop beliefs that serve their own interests, and in his case, he could have certainly have used the Marxist, Leninist ideology as a means of justifying his own ambition, just flat out power and territory and things like that. I know there's a story about how at one point, Stalin was not well educated at all, and in fact, during the Bolshevik Revolution, he was basically a professional bank robber for the Bolsheviks. He was in their, I guess you could say, he was in their fundraising division, and that's how he raised funds, was through bank robbery. But so he was essentially a criminal who became politically powerful. But there's a story about how he never really understood Marxist theory that well, and dialectical materialism and all the stuff that influenced that, like Hegel and all that. So at one point, he actually hired a tutor to teach him Hegel and Marx and dialectical materialism, and then he decided it was just too much to be bothered with and had the tutor executed. You really have to wonder what Stalin's motives were. Was it just simply power? Were there ideological motives?
Yeah. In a lot of cases, a pathological leader will use the tools at hand, the ideology at hand, to help him solidify control. To how much does he actually believe it, to keep up appearances, or how much does he really believe it? It's difficult to tell. But referring to the neocon fantasy of, well, if we got rid of Hitler, there'd be peace in Europe. Of course not. There'd be communist takeover of Europe. Now, the Forrestal, I think he was Secretary of the Navy, and his Forrestal diaries, he reports in a conversation with Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, our former president. And then he's repeating what Kennedy said. Kennedy said that Russia's demand for incorporating Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania into the USSR was the stumbling block in the spring of 1939 to any understanding between Russia and England. The fundamental difficulty of England, however, was that if they backed Germany, they were then faced with a greater Germany, a weakened France, and a relatively defenseless England. Whereas an alliance with Russia and the ultimate destruction of Germany would present England with precisely the problem they now have, namely a vacuum in Central Europe into which the Russian influence will flow. See, this is why the neocons are really just kind of, I think, they're not really serious geostrategic thinkers. Because who do they think is going to fill the void of Central Europe if you remove a strong Germany? If you support Stalin to defeat Hitler, Stalin takes over. If you support Hitler to stop Stalin, Hitler takes over. You've got to have one of the two dictatorships are going to take over. You just got to pick which one. And I think, we don't know what would have happened otherwise, but I can't imagine a world worse than the one in which communism takes over. I mean, the Black Book of Communism says that 100 million people died under communism, and most of them were killed after World War II in Eastern Europe and East Asia.
Yes, well, you see these kinds of limitations in the neocons' thinking when they try to apply these ideas to the situation in the Middle East as well. When Saddam Hussein was removed from power, who did they think was going to take his place? Well, at the time that the war in Iraq, and during the build-up to the war in Iraq, I mean, I knew what would happen, just being a layperson with just a limited, undergrad level knowledge of that region. I knew that if the Saddam Hussein regime was removed, that what would happen is you'd have a split between the Kurds and the Shiites and the Sunni, and then you'd have these Sunni fundamentalist terrorist groups that would emerge, and then the Shia region would fall under the influence of Iran, and then the Kurds would take up their fight for independence. And if the Americans had any kind of successful occupation at all, it would be a puppet regime that was unpopular with the people and ruled through force. The idea that you were going to have a Western European parliamentary system in Iraq was absurd. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, everything that's happened in Iraq in the last 13 years, it was entirely predictable. I mean, anybody with just a very, basic, like I said, undergraduate level knowledge of that particular region could have predicted it. The same is true with Afghanistan. I remember when the war in Afghanistan started, I remember thinking, well, the occupation of Afghanistan didn't work for the Soviet Union. It didn't work for the British. It didn't work for the Romans. It didn't work for Alexander the Great. How is it going to work for the Americans, particularly given that the Americans have such an awful track record when it comes to fighting that kind of war? And sure enough, that's more or less what happened. I mean, it was, the outcome of that particular war was entirely predictable as well. And so it's like the one thing that's interesting about the neocons is that they really do seem to be a movement that bases its geopolitical and geostrategic and military policies on raw ideology. And I think that's, part of the reason why it's justified to compare them to the Trotskyites. I mean, not only were, the early neocon godfathers, not only did, that if we trace it back far enough, not only does neoconservatism have its roots in Trotskyism, but even without that, you see this kind of commitment to the view that everything, that ideology is what guides history. It's what guides society. And that, if you have an ideology that's correct, well, you can't lose. And it goes back to Trotsky's idea that, when in the years leading up to World War II, what was Trotsky saying? Trotsky thought that World War II was going to be the basis of a worldwide communist revolution. He thought when the war was coming that, well, this is going to result in a major victory for communism. There's a worldwide proletarian revolution, and the neocons apply that kind of logic to a lot of their geopolitical outlook as well. It's almost like it's a straight line trajectory, if you will.
Yeah. The American geopolitician Nicholas Spikeman, he died in 1943, but he was one of the leading geostrategic analysts for the United States. He predicted, he said, look, when you win this war, do not destroy Germany or Japan, because China and Russia will take their place. And he was absolutely right, and nobody listened. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to figure that out. The thing that I find so bizarre, but even World War I, is this idea that Germany, which sits in the middle of Europe and is the most dynamic and powerful of the European nations, had to be destroyed. I mean, look, you can't have Europe without Germany. You never could. The Holy Roman Empire, Germany has always sat at the heart of Europe and always had the commanding position. It was only for a few centuries when France had the lead and Germany was divided until it was reunited by the Prussians that role was lost. In the Middle Ages with the Holy Roman Empire and in the Renaissance, and then in the modern age with Germany, it's always been in that position. You can't get rid of it. And trying to rewrite 1,000 years of history is insanity. And then again, who would fill the void? Well, it's not going to be France or England. It's going to be Russia. And the only sane option would have been to keep Germany strong enough to defeat the Russians. And in both world wars, the Western powers, the Americans finally realized that in 1948. But at that point, they'd already lost half of Germany to the Soviets. The other half, they reconstituted to form West Germany and West Germany under NATO in 1955. But this whole idea that you could rewrite 1,000 years of European history by pretending that there can be no Germany is ludicrous. I mean, Germany's always been the bulwark against the East. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto defeated the Magyars in 955 at Lechfeld, and the Germans were there to drive back subsequent invaders. They might have been Austrians, they might have been the Holy Roman Empire, they might have been Germany itself, but they were always there to do that role. And but trying to pretend that that's not an issue is ludicrous. It's like the leadership of the Western powers in World War II completely ignored the previous 1,000 years of European political history. The idea. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that gets back to the idea of American exceptionalism in some ways. I think that American political leaders have long had this idea that they are somehow distinctive from traditional Europe. During the Iraq War period, you had guys like Rumsfeld and Cheney making fun of old Europe because they didn't share their enthusiasm for war with Iraq. And I think that that's always been a powerful aspect of American elite thinking, is that this is somehow the United States is a civilization that's set apart from Europe. That that these were this. They're this benighted society that we broke away from and created this enlightened, exceptional culture, and that somehow the laws of history all of the historical forces that have shaped European history really don't apply. I think that because that explains very well the conduct of American leaders during these particular wars. It's as you were saying, it's like they thought that the previous 1,000 years of European history simply didn't matter. It's like they thought they were erasing history. and starting over, and which in turn fits with their, the other utopian ideas they had about the war to end all wars and the war to make the world safe for democracy and all of that. And I think that was a big part of what they thought they were doing with some of these policies, that they thought they were simply erasing history and essentially carrying out a type of revolution. They were overthrowing these old backward European and Asian societies and bringing them into the age of enlightenment and liberalism and progress and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. But the funny thing is, even Great Britain, which should have been familiar and rooted in these historical realities, was willing to forget them as well. I mean, beginning around, 1750-ish, the general European consensus had been to keep Russia out. Even when Russia, under the Tsars, was still a Christian country, it was still seen as somewhat despotic, somewhat foreign to the European political system. And while between Peter the Great and the Russian Revolution, Russia had been sort of integrated into that political system, they always said, keep the Russians out. A classic example would be the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. The Russians had defeated the Turks brutally and were going to extract great gains. But the European powers all rallied together and said, no, stop. That's too much. And they forced Russia to give up territory because it would have led to a war, which they could hope to win. And everybody knew this. There's just common sense, keep the Russians out. But in a kind of mass insanity in World War II, not only did we give up the idea of keeping the Russians out, as from the previous Roosevelt quote, we wanted to give Stalin everything he wanted, which would have been a complete turnover of 250 years of European political theory. And it was a disaster, as it should have been known to any true statesman. And I think in many ways we can see parallels in Asia with the collapse of the Japanese Empire. I mean, what was going to replace the Japanese Empire? There were the nationalist Chinese, and then there were the communists. So, it could have been the nationalists. It wasn't, and I think in part it was due to sabotage by people like Harry Dexter White, who sabotaged a gold shipment that might have saved the Chinese economy. Also, there were weapons that had been sold to the nationalists that were never delivered. So they were certainly, the U.S., their erstwhile ally, was not being very cooperative. And then there was, of course, the 6-month truce that was negotiated by Marshall, which, of course, only allowed the communists to regain strength and conquer. And ultimately, the communists did conquer, and they killed 70 million Chinese, according to modern estimates. So, as bad as the Japanese were, one, they were no worse than any other previous warlord, whether it was the Mongols or the Chinese emperors, who had various civil wars and bloodbaths. The Japanese were no worse than any other Eastern invader that had invaded China, or even Chinese warlords or Chinese leaders that going back 2,000 years. Japan was nothing unique in that regard, so it's like a toss-up. What, Chinese dictator, Japanese dictator? In fact, during the Japanese occupation, many Chinese viewed them as just another warlord sect, another group. There were the communist warlords, there were the nationalist warlords, there were the warlords, and there were the Japanese warlords. It's just one more warlord of the whole big soup of warlords. And they said, well, okay, we'll just work with this warlord for now. And even Chiang Kai-shek knew the real threat was the communists. He famously said, the Japanese are a disease of the skin, but the communists are a disease of the soul. And by 1941, I think it was the 5th Route Army incident, where he actually attacked communist troops. In 1936, he'd been forced to sign a treaty with the communists to fight the Japanese. He'd been kidnapped by his own generals. But in 1941, he actually attacked communist forces outright. And that was the end of the truce. And so the Japanese and the nationalists were technically at war, but it's kind of like we're both at war and we both know it, but we're really going to be fighting the communists right now. And that was kind of the attitude that they had. And, the United States had no knowledge on the ground of what was going on in China. Wiedemeyer did, but nobody listened. And so in the end, the communists take over and kill 70 million Chinese. We have to fight in Korea and Vietnam, which has leads to the death of 100,000 Americans and countless East Asians. I mean, clearly, any sober assessment would say that the Japanese Empire, the greater Coast Asia prosperity sphere, would have been better than what we actually did have happen.
Oh yeah, I mean if the Americans had accepted a conditional surrender from the Germans and the Japanese, I mean, yeah, the Soviets could have been contained to some degree at least. And I think probably even more significantly would have been the fact that you wouldn't have had the Chinese Communist Revolution, that you wouldn't have had the spread of communism into Korea and Indochina eventually. And I think that's really one of the worst things that came out of World War II was the fact that these communist movements eventually conquered all of or so much of Asia, because as you mentioned, the body count that they generated was so high. The regime in China in particular, 70 million deaths, and then then there's the Kim Il Sung and Pol Pot and all of these others. I know Rudy Rummel, R.J. Rummel, who compiled the statistics of deaths at the hands of states in the 20th century. Has his top 10 list or whatever, all the bad guys, and most of them are communist regimes, and with the exception of Nazi Germany and I think the Ottoman Turks and maybe some others. Most of these regimes were communist regimes: the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Kim's North Korea, and Pol Pot and Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam. And that really is what came about as a result of the total decimation of the Japanese, the total removal of the Japanese as a bulwark against these movements. Really is what allowed them to take over East Asia and generate the kind of body count that they generated.
Yeah, and switching back to Europe briefly, the Soviet, beginning in 1943, after the Battle of Kursk, when the Germans were pretty much going to lose on the Eastern Front, it was pretty clear at that point they couldn't turn it around. And the Russians were beginning to move back into the outlying territories of the Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Belarus. Beginning with the Ukraine and all the way up to Berlin, the Red Army engaged in a series of atrocities, murders, rapes that are unparalleled in human history. In Germany alone, I think 2 million women were raped. There are accounts of women being raped 18 times in a single night and dying. They would literally, anything that wasn't nailed to the ground, they just pick up and take away. In the Ukraine alone, they just butchered and murdered hundreds of thousands of people because the Ukrainians hated the communists. They collaborated with the Nazis all the way through. In fact, there were some Ukrainian terrorists that killed a Russian general, Vatutin, and the reprisals for killing that general were vicious. And the amount of theft, murder, rape that occurred on the Eastern Front is really inexplicable. Nobody can really understand it. That's why, alone of all the Allied POWs, Russian POWs didn't want to go back home.
Well, that's interesting as well that you bring that up, because that's another aspect of the war that's widely ignored, and that is the atrocities that were committed in Eastern Europe during the Soviet occupation. And this was even before the Soviets managed to consolidate control over that region politically and install all of the puppet regimes, and and that's how they got the regimes like Nicolae Ceausescu and Vahotza and all of that kind of stuff eventually. But even in the immediate aftermath of the war, as you were saying, not only were there the atrocities like the gang rapes and that kind of stuff, but there was also ethnic cleansing of ethnic Germans. I mean, I've heard estimates that as many as 2 million ethnic Germans were actually killed in ethnic cleansing in the Eastern European region following the war. I don't know really what the accurate statistics are on that, but there's a lot of evidence that there was a far-reaching atrocities committed against ethnic Germans during that time period by the Russians. And yeah, you're also you point out that the Soviet POWs often didn't want to return. That's true as well. That's interesting to consider.
You see, one of the way and during the Cold War era, the Allies, the Anglo historians would deal with that was they said, well, the Germans had it coming. It was karma. Well, okay, first of all, saying that women and children getting murdered and raped is karma is sick. But second of all, they weren't just Germans. They were Poles, Ukrainians. In fact, one of the communist members of the Yugoslav government, Milo Volgilis, wrote to Joseph Stalin that Soviet troops were raping Yugoslavian women. And he's like, Stalin, we're your allies. your troops are raping our own women. And Stalin said, let the boys have a little bit of fun. And so, I mean, it was really this indiscriminate mass rape. I mean, literally all over Europe, all over Eastern Europe, friend and foe alike were not safe from the lust of the Red Army. And the ethnic cleansing is also interesting. At the end of World War II was probably the greatest case of ethnic cleansing in human history. Czechoslovakia, Poland, and elsewhere. I think also the Hungarians were kicked out of Transylvania to make room for the Romanians. And all over the place, people were just being murdered and kicked out of their homes on a scale that really dwarfed anything Western Europe knew under the Nazi occupation, and could only be comparable to maybe the Nazi invasion of Russia. Now, I don't know what happened in China at the end of the Civil War, but I can imagine something on an equally horrifying scale by Mao's thugs probably occurred as well.
Well, in Maoist China, when the communists took power, I mean, they had massive executions of. I mean, they would execute 1 million people at a time, and the alleged crimes would be things like, having prospered under the former regime. It was very similar to what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. They had the death penalty for, having a Western education or dressing in a Western style of clothes, or, professionals were educated because they thought they had either been tainted by Western influence, or they had somehow, they weren't good working peasants, they were members of the bourgeoisie or whatever.
Didn't the Pol Pot regime kill about 1/3 of the population?
Yeah, well, the numbers on that have been disputed. I've heard numbers as high as 50%, and I've heard numbers more in the 20% range. One thing that's difficult when it comes to trying to actually get an estimate of the number of people killed by Pol Pot is the fact that so many people were killed in the war in the 5 years prior to that, from the time that the Americans invaded Cambodia and started the bombing in 1970 up until the time that the Khmer Rouge took power in 1975. During that time period, you had such a massive bombardment of Cambodia with American bombing and killings that it's really unknown how many people were killed in that versus what came afterward. There were probably hundreds of thousands killed in the bombing initially, and
well, not only that, the Vietnamese occupation from was it 79 to 89, and the insurrection that went on there killed hundreds of thousands as well, I think.
Yeah. That country was in, war was, that country went through about a 25-year civil war. And a bloody war, as bloody as any war could be. But as far as the numbers behind the Khmer Rouge, I've heard, usually on the high end, the number is around 3 million deaths. On the low end, it's more like in the 500, 600,000 range. So, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, 1 million or something like that. Although you have to consider that it was a relatively small country with a relatively small population. I mean, killing 1 million people under any circumstance is a lot of people. But in terms of per capita deaths, Pol Pot pretty much set a record for genocides. But the Maoist China was about as bad. I mean, the Pol Pot was probably more influenced by Maoist China than any other regime. And in fact, he got his name from them. His real name was Saleh Sar. That's his Khmer name. But the Pol Pot is it means political potential. It's an abbreviation for the words political potential, which that was a name that the Maoists gave him in China when he was there. They thought he had a lot of political potential, so that became sort of his operative name. And of course, he also went by Brother Number One when they were operating underground in Cambodia as well. But the Maoist genocide in China was at least as bad as anything that was done in Europe. It was they would kill 1 million people at a time. They would kill people for anything that they that could be reasonably considered having collaborated with the previous regime, or even unreasonably considered. And they would kill people for belonging to the wrong class. And that kind of stuff happened in the aftermath of the Communist Revolution in 1949 and the 50s. Not to mention the horrendous economic policies that Maoist China imposed during the Great Leap Forward. I mean, they had people in power in China, one of the world's most populated countries, that thought they were going to industrialize China by having people, melt down iron in a stove in the backyard and things like that. I mean, this is how crazy some of their ideas were.
Well, one of the crazy ideas was they had an idea that a sparrow was a pest, and they had the campaign to kill the sparrow. And it turned out that the sparrows were eating grasshoppers and locusts and other pests. And the Great Famine that was engineered by the communist economic policies was massively exaggerated by this explosion of locusts, and they had to import sparrows from the Soviet Union. I mean, Keith, how stupid do you have to be to think to declare war on the sparrow?
Yeah, it's they pursued a lot of really bizarre policies during the time of Mao. I mean, of course, the Cultural Revolution was crazy. I mean, you had these university students. Imagine they were I guess they were kind of like our social justice warriors on our campuses today. Only they were actually throwing people out of windows from the high rises and that kind of thing. So yeah, that was a really dysfunctional society as well. And in Cambodia, they took what Maoism had done in China, and I guess they amplified it, up to level 10.
Yeah. I would say that as a reflection, but in fact, in 1950, George Kennan, he gave a lecture, and he said that the United States was less safe in 1950, because by this point the Soviets had acquired atomic weapons, than in any other previous time in its history. And that the foreign policy of the United States from the beginning of the 20th century up until 1950, which was allegedly predicated on defending American interests, had been a complete and utter failure. In fact, Herbert Hoover said after the war, there were more governments under totalitarian regimes than there was before the war. And in fact, every stated goal of the war, increasing freedom, protecting the weak, Poland and China, the two nations we went to war to protect, were given over to communism. It was a farce. The whole thing had nothing to do with expanding democracy or defending the weak countries. A classic example of a violation of a neutral is Iran. In June, I think it was the summer of 1941, England and the Soviet Union invaded Iran under trumped-up charges of Nazi collaboration to open up a supply line to Russia through the Caucasus. And, nobody cares about that, even though it's a violation of neutral rights. I think that the Western allies under Roosevelt, Truman, and Churchill, and Clement Attlee were really some of the greatest war criminals of all time, collaborating with the likes of Joseph Stalin. I mean, the United States created the Communist Chinese Army. We trained them and equipped them during the war. We created the army of Ho Chi Minh during the war. All these communists that would later come to bite us in the ass, decade, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, we all trained and equipped them. We gave them political support, military support. And what was the result? That these peoples of Eastern Europe and East Asia were brought into the most despotic and horrific regimes in human history. And which never would have happened had the United States and England either mined well enough alone or had acted prudentially in containing the true danger of communism.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how in World War I they went to war to make the world safe for democracy, but like you were pointing out, in the second half of the 20th century, for most of that time, something like a third of the world's population lived under communist regimes, and most of the other regimes around the world were, I guess you could say, they were fascist, or at least they were very similar to what fascism was, a kind of strongman rule. There's an article that was published in the early 90s by the Libertarian Alliance. There's a writer named David Ramsey Steele who did an interesting study of fascism, and he was saying that probably the majority of the world's regimes in the late, in the mid to late 20th century period were very similar to fascism. So you had, so who were the real victors that came out of World War II? Well, you had, strongman, authoritarian, right-wing governments in some places, and you had you had communist regimes in other places, and there really wasn't that much left. Even in my own lifetime, when I was growing up, say in the 70s, I remember back then, the Soviet Union and its satellites, or Maoist China and its allies, they controlled most of the world. And most other places were these, third world countries with these strongman military governments, and they were notorious for their police torture and all of that kind of stuff. And that's really what World War II produced. Those were the kinds of systems that came out of it.
Yeah, exactly. We mentioned the governments of Eastern Europe and how they weren't liberal democracies. But even if you look at, say, the Baltic states or Poland or Romania or Hungary, those regimes were far less authoritarian, far less despotic than, say, the right-wing thugs of, say, a Saddam Hussein or a Sadat, or the communist thugs of Mao and Stalin. They were, or even go back to like the third world. Let's look at Afghanistan and Tibet. Tibet was ruled by a theocracy under the, I forget the guy's name now.
The Dalai Lama.
The Dalai Lama. Afghanistan was under a monarchy. But does anybody think that the current rule in Afghanistan or Tibet is better than it was in the 1920s or 30s? Of course it was better back then for those people. You go to Saudi Arabia, it wasn't great, but with the corruption of the House of Saud now, or Iran under the Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was ousted in 1941 by the British. He was a reformist dictator, as it will, and there was certain popular support for his Western reforms. And the subsequent dictators, the Ayatollahs that took over Iran, Saddam took over. Saddam was a butcher. He killed hundreds of thousands of people, the Kurds, the Iranians. It was a real despicable figure. But really, things got worse. Only a blind man could think it got better after World War II.
Yeah, well, and now on top of that, you also had the arms race as well that came out of that. You had the spread of these authoritarian right-wing governments and communism, and you had the arms race going on at the same time. And it's interesting, too, that the neocons are still pursuing the same kinds of policies. They're doing the same thing with in the Middle East now. They cultivate these terrorist organizations, these Islamist terrorist organizations, as a bulwark against Arab nationalism or nationalist movements in that part of the world. And the same kind of thing is coming out of it. You're getting groups like ISIS and all of this kind of thing being perpetrated.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's the other thing. I don't know how neoconservatives can position themselves as anti-communist when the fact is they support the greatest pro-communist war in history. Without World War II, we never would have had communism in Asia. The Japanese would have stamped that out easily. And in Eastern Europe, the Nazis would have likely contained Soviet communism. So anybody with like anti-communist bona fides really has to oppose World War II itself.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier in the podcast, in its day, it was called the Communist War by some people because the American communists in particular were very zealous proponents of that particular war. In fact, it was interesting during when World War II was going on in the United States, there was a sedition trial of opponents of the war, featuring Lawrence Dennis and some other well-known figures, as well as some of the usual kind of marginal figures as well. And the American Communist Party were very zealous proponents of this particular prosecution. They viewed it as, suppression of the fascists and all of that kind of thing. And these people were all prosecuted under the Smith Act, which is sort of an anti-sedition act passed by the federal government. But ironically, about 10 years later, the leadership of the Communist Party was prosecuted under the same act, under the Smith Act in the 1950s. And some of their leaders ended up getting put in prison. So I guess what goes around comes around.
It's karma, right?
Right.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up. So if you have any last words, anything you want to end with, Keith?
For those that are interested in knowing more about me, you can check out our website at attackthesystem.com. Attackthesystem.com. I also have a book coming out from Black House Publishing in London. It'll probably be out at the end of the month. You may be able to pre-order it from the publisher, but it's called Totalitarianism in the Postmodern Age, Tyranny of the Politically Correct. So you can be on the lookout for that.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.